Hi, this is Dr. Cindy Woody with a video for you to help with the constructed response question number 1 on the TExES 268 Principal as Instructional Leader exam. I hear that all of these give you fits, so let's see if we can help you. So the first thing I want to tell you about constructed response question number 1 is that it focuses on instruction. So you're going to have the context provided for you in the exam, and they're going to tell you basically this scenario. The principal goes in to observe instruction in the classroom. When you get in the classroom, you can see various types of evidence that represent the planning, the instruction, and the assessment efforts of the teacher. You can also see what students are doing. You'll have a chance to observe the students in the video, and you can view the student outcomes on the results from the formative assessment tool, which is probably going to be an exit ticket. And then the principal is planning in the response for attending a teacher-led meeting where the principal will be providing instructional coaching. So when they say teacher-led, what they mean is it's an open-ended opportunity for the principal to provide open-ended questions and some feedback to help the teacher arrive at their own conclusions for next steps, how they can improve their instructional performance. So when you get into the exam, what you're given is a lesson plan, and that represents all the planning activities. You'll also, in the lesson plan, you'll see the state standards. You'll be provided with an exit ticket, a teacher-created exemplar, and some sample student responses. So depending on what the scenario is, the exit ticket could be about math or language arts. It could be something that's very skills-based or something very conceptual, but typically it's going to combine a number of elements in the actual lesson. So you're not focused on just one thing, one skill, or one concept. In the example they provide for you, you'll have multiple things. And then you'll also have video clips of what you observe. So you'll be able to see instruction as if you were the principal walking or sitting in the classroom. Let's see if we can get this up here. The handbook for you that provided by Pearson, the handbook provided by Pearson for the 268 exam has the related definitions that are approved by the test creators and scorers. So you need to be familiar with their version of these definitions. So you'll hear the word exemplar. In their context, an exemplar is an example or a model that has the desired characteristics of a high quality response. An exemplar is a concrete illustration of the evidence needed to meet a desired standard. So if you have a teacher created exemplar, what that means is the teacher has created an answer that they would like to see the students produce during the independent practice or the assessment portion of the lesson on the exit ticket. An exemplar is a concrete illustration of the evidence needed to meet the desired standard. So in the exemplar, notice that you'll have the comparison of what the teacher wants the students to produce versus what the students actually produce. You'll have an exit ticket in most cases. An exit ticket is a short formative assessment given by a teacher after completing a lesson to determine the degree to which students learned the material taught in the lesson. So always pay close attention to the exit ticket results. And I'll talk to you in a minute about the different kinds of things you might see. The word high leverage, or the phrase high leverage, I guess that's a hyphenated word. They use that to mean having the characteristics of the most effective and efficient way to address the most important aspect of a situation. So in question 1 of the constructive response, you're really going to drill down to one significant issue, and that's what they're calling high leverage. And then we have other related definitions, instructional coaching and a probing question. So in the case of the PIL exam, instructional coaching is what we expect the principal to be doing. And it's a process for developing a teacher's knowledge and skills and their practice to improve instruction and student learning. By offering individual support and feedback in a non-evaluative and trusting setting, an instructional coach works with the teacher to provide ongoing and job-embedded professional development specific to the teacher's needs. So this helps you set up the ideal situation here. You're the ideal principal, and you're working with a willing and able teacher who wants to improve their practice as a teacher. And then the probing question, or the coaching question, the guiding question, This is a question that is intended to help others think more deeply about an issue. Probing questions are more than clarifying questions, and they help move toward challenging assumptions and exposing contradictions, which leads to new understandings. So an example of a question that would not be probing is, what do you think you did wrong? Well, that might even be probing. You could say a not probing question. How many students got the answer right on number 1? That question is not a probing question. That doesn't really make you think a lot. So we'll be talking about some probing questions. Okay, so there's 4 parts of question 1, and you can anticipate these 4 parts will be consistent no matter which version of the exam you get. These are just general great questions. So the first part is to state 1 high leverage instructional practice needing improvement. B is identify 1 high leverage action step that can be implemented by the teacher. C is provide 1 guiding question. And D, I left the D off, is explain how the action step and the question work together to improve teaching and support learning. So let's get down in here. Let's drill down to, let's see if I can get rid of this for a minute. Let's drill down to 3 types of common high leverage practices you might want to focus on. So these are examples, and if I were you, I would try to keep these 3 big examples in mind and use one of them on my exam. So one example you might see is a pacing issue. Another example is a teacher with an alignment issue. And a third one is a teacher who doesn't realize that a skill needs to be taught explicitly. So let's look at what that means. So if I were going to look at an example, like let's say the one in the practice manual for number 1 is a teacher who's working with young students on poetry, and as part of that, they're trying to understand how to find text evidence to support their inferences. So there's 2 things going on in that lesson that you're observing in the example. In the handbook, you're observing a teacher who's trying to teach a basic skill about poetry, or the descriptive types of things about poetry, which is not difficult. And also, they're trying to teach a very complicated concept of making an inference and supporting that inference through finding text evidence, identifying text evidence. So if it's a pacing issue, you'll see that the teacher spends too long on the easier things and not long enough on the challenging things, or they spend an equal amount of time on the easy and the challenging things. So you want to recommend in that case that the teacher focus on adjusting the pace of the lessons so that the most challenging concepts receive the most time and attention. If you want to call it an alignment issue, then you say the rigor of the expected elements don't align with the rigor of the elements that you observed don't align with the expected level of rigor. So let's say that the students were not able or not given an opportunity to practice finding text evidence, which is very rigorous, and then maybe on the exit ticket they were not asked to do that, or they were asked to do it and they hadn't been provided with an opportunity to practice that. So that's an alignment issue. And then explicit instruction means teaching a challenging skill or concept explicitly so that students have what we call a crisp understanding of this new learning, so that no matter what, they can always get this right. So explicit instruction would also have fit with the example provided in the manual. So the students were supposed to make inferences and justify those inferences with text evidence. So those are really 2 different skills. Making an inference is one skill. Justifying it with text evidence is another but related skill. So those things need to be taught explicitly. So I could also see how that would be one that you could say explicit instruction is a great recommendation for this teacher in the example. Okay, let's look at the next one. So when we talk about high leverage action steps, we want to go ahead and make sure that we align our action step with the same big idea that you've put in for your high leverage practice that you want to see improved. So if you say you want the pacing to improve, then you need a pacing action step. If you want to improve the alignment, you need an alignment action step. If you want to improve explicit instruction, then you need an explicit instruction action step. So these are just some examples. These might not fit with your context you're given in your exam, but should be fairly close because these are somewhat generic. So in a pacing example, an action step might be to ask the teacher, when you're planning for instruction, I want to see that you identify the concepts that have already been mastered by the students so more time can be devoted to new or more challenging concepts. Or you might say, identify the concepts that are less challenging versus more challenging so that the students have more time to spend on the more challenging concepts. Either one of those could be a good action step for pacing. For alignment, an action step might say something like, when designing a plan to reteach this concept, I'd like to see you break down the wording of the TExES to identify the rigor level expectations so the instruction and the practice will provide sufficient rigor. And when you're talking about an action step for explicit instruction, you might say something like, when planning for small group instruction, articulate how the missed concept can be taught explicitly and plan for repeated opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding of this particular concept. So notice I didn't just say I want to see you do better in this. I gave a specific context. I said when you're planning for your next time, or when you're designing a plan for the reteach, or when you're working with small groups in the coming days. So I gave them sort of a setting for when this could happen, and I specifically identified something that I would like to see them do to improve the area of need. So pacing, alignment, explicit instruction. You can focus on these big ideas and then move these smaller concepts around. Like, do you anticipate that they'll be working with small groups? You know, that might be appropriate for this teacher who's doing poetry, or maybe tomorrow she should go in and she should design a plan, or she should be working on reteaching this concept. Or maybe when she's planning for future instruction, maybe we're not going to go back to this immediately tomorrow, or maybe we don't think she'll have small group instruction tomorrow. Maybe we know this is a concept that will continue to develop in many ways across time, like making inferences and using text evidence. That's in all subject areas, and she could do that in more opportunities in future lessons. Okay, so here's some examples of some guiding questions. So if you're focused on pacing, a guiding question could be something like, what factors do you use to help you determine the pacing of your lesson plan? And how do you know if you need to adjust the pacing during instruction? So you're trying to get her to think about what went wrong without saying, hey, I noticed this was terrible. You just want to focus on the fact that you know that she could have done better in pacing. You've already helped her identify that through your coaching question and through your area of improvement you'd like to see. So now you're focused on your guiding question to help her get going on this. I hope that makes sense. So let's go back to it. So for an example of a guiding question for pacing, what factors do you use to help you determine the pacing of your lesson plan? And how do you know if you need to adjust the pacing during the instruction? So it's a complex question that she could take and go with a lot of different directions, and none of those are really going to be wrong. And remember, she's an ideal teacher just like you're an ideal principal, and she has the skill set. She's 5 years into the program in this scenario they gave. Alignment. What steps do you take to ensure alignment in your lessons, activities, and assessment tools? So with this type of question, this would be helpful if you saw maybe the exit ticket was misaligned, or maybe she spent the bulk of the lesson on lower level activities and they couldn't tackle a good rigorous assessment. Or even with explicit instruction, we know for sure that there was one question that all the students did poorly on, or they all chose the same wrong answer, or they showed a great deal of confusion. How do you know if your students fully understand each concept before moving to the exit ticket? So with explicit instruction, that helps a teacher with this kind of question to pull out, I should find a way to know if they don't really understand. And it might be that she's going to develop a system where she does laps and she checks during the monitoring of the guided practice and independent practice for different parts of the explicit instruction. So when you put it all together, your response is going to look something like this. You're going to state your instructional improvement recommendation. So I've given you some examples of what you might state. And then they expect you to state evidence from an artifact they gave you, and then another piece of evidence from another artifact provided. If you look at the example in the handbook, the difference between a 3 and a 4, one of the differences is on the 4, the person specifically said, in the video, I noticed that when she monitored for student practice, many students had the same types of questions or the same misconcepts. So in the example from the one that scored a 3, they just said, I noticed in the video students were confused. So they were a little more specific with the kinds of evidence. Or when the teacher asked this question, the student said this. That's a specific reference to the evidence rather than a general one that said the video showed. Then you want to go into another artifact and provide another piece of evidence. So if you put evidence, two pieces of evidence from the same artifact, that will score you lower than if you put an evidence, say, from the lesson plan, and evidence from the exit ticket, or an evidence from the video, and evidence from the student responses to the exemplar. Okay, B is state your action step. So you're going to clearly state your action step. I would like to see this teacher do this, or the teacher should do this. One way the teacher could improve is through this. But one thing I noticed when I looked at the rubric, it's unstated but graded is what I call it. It doesn't really say in the directions, but they hold you accountable for explaining how or why this step can make a difference. So when you say your action step, let's say my action step was one of the ones, we'll go back here just for a second. We're going to do this one. When planning for instruction, identify the concepts that have already been mastered by students so more time can be devoted to new or more challenging concepts. If you're going to get credit for this unstated but graded part on the rubric, you could say this would make a big difference for students in, I forgot now what I said, identify. So this would make a big difference for students because it would provide more time for them to focus on understanding the more challenging concepts, such as finding text evidence to justify an inference. Okay, so then C is you're going to state your coaching question, and since D is where you tie your coaching question and your action step together, you don't really need to say much else here, because D you're going to go right into, after you state your coaching question, explain how the action step and coaching question will work together to improve teaching and learning. So remember, all of this leads up to the fact that when you go into your teacher-led conference, you're going to lead with your coaching question and your feedback from what you saw. So these things should tie together with your action step that you've developed so that the teacher and the appraiser are aligned on this thing, so that you're together. So you're going to explain how the action step and coaching question will work together to improve teaching and learning. So I put a little bit more elaboration on that one here. So you must state, when you're talking about tying them together, you must state the rationale for both the action step and the coaching question. So let's say that I said for my action step that I wanted to explicitly work on explicit instruction by making sure that students had an opportunity to learn about text evidence and justifying their answer. So I want to work on explicit instruction. And then I also said my coaching question was, what was my coaching question for explicit instruction? How do you know if students fully understand each concept before moving to the exit ticket? So when I do my explanation, my rationale for how these work together, the rationale is that I'm going to bring the teacher to an understanding of how these things can change instruction for students. And I'll see that in the evidence when students are able to answer these text-related questions or whatever your context is given. I want to briefly mention both how it will improve the teacher's instruction and how it will improve the student instruction. So when it ties together, make sure you understand that you have to tell them the impact, that you believe that making this small change can make a great impact on the teacher instruction by helping the teacher make better lesson plans, or helping the teacher deliver better pacing in the classroom, helping the teacher understand more about how the alignment of the standard can result in better understanding of the student when they apply the skill. And then you want to talk about the student learning. You want to say that students are going to benefit from this, that their learning will be supported because they will be able to do what now? Now they will be able to clearly understand. Now they will have more time to really think deeply and learn deeply. They'll have a better opportunity to practice at the correct rigor level. So mention something about student learning. And this is where you can briefly mention little details you noticed. So you may want to say something like in the exemplar they said, because this teacher has 5 years experience, she's ready to add this refinement. Or you might say something about, this could help avoid the point in the video where the students were confused when the teacher was circulating during independent practice and the students continued to have to ask her what it meant, or she had to ask the students what it meant to use text evidence. What you don't want to do is you don't want to add details outside the context provided. And I noticed in the examples for the 2 and the 3 exemplar, the 1 and the 2 exemplars, the low scoring exemplars for this question, that they added things like students this age love poetry. You don't know that. That's not provided in this context. It doesn't say anything about students loving poetry. So just because you have real world knowledge in the area doesn't mean you get to add that and contribute it to this scenario. You stick with what they gave you. You've got enough with what they've given you. Okay, and last thing I want to tell you is you know this stuff. This question is going to focus on instruction. In order to become a principal, you have to have taught school for at least 2 years. You know how to teach. You know instruction. Just pick one thing and stick with it on all 4 parts. So if you're talking about pacing, do pacing all the way through. If you're talking about alignment, do alignment all the way through. If you're talking about explicit instruction, do explicit instruction all the way through. You don't have to be an expert on the content of the lesson to help a teacher grow and improve. So at some point in your career, no matter how brilliant and well-rounded you are, you're going to encounter a subject area or a lesson about which you know very little personally, and you're going to have to be able to still work with that teacher and help them find improvement. So if you're not a math person and this is a math question, don't sweat the math, and vice versa for language arts. If you're not into all of the language arts, poetry and those kinds of things, it's not really about the content. It's about finding the answers to get the teacher where they need to be. And then the last thing is, remember, you are the ideal principal who's assisting a kind-hearted, willing, able professional who's just trying to get a little better each and every day. So you answer it as if it's perfect world conditions. And remember, like this cow, I want you to be outstanding in your field. Thanks. Best wishes on the passing your 268 in flying colors.